Hello, it's Dr. Coates. It was a very hot day, and so I'm not wearing a tie. And once again, I'm recording this from home. You can tell by the framed picture of Central Park above me, which is not hanging in my office, but is hanging in my family room. So, sorry about the no tie, and I'm kind of lounging, I guess it looks like, but what have you. Okay, so this is the second of two lectures on concretism, the progenitor of the visual poetry that we know and love from the internet. And as I said on Tuesday, if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, the English department here at VCU does have a lot of really talented people working on visual poetry, these sort of internet versions of these. And I also want to make clear that a lot of the concrete poetry that happened in the 1920s through the 1960s actually has been rendered as animated GIFs, which I think make absolutely clear why this particular strain of modernist poetry has taken off since the invention of the personal computer. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so the part of what we're doing in this class is just to get you to know how to read poetry in general. It's occurred to me since then that when I say visual poetry, I have since the beginning of this course meant the visual aspects of poetry, including imagery especially. But someone else might have come along and asked, why are you not studying all internet poems? So my response to that is, you can, or you will be able to by the end of this course. And so you could have a conversation with anybody who's working on or creating visual poetry in the English department at VCU, and my hope is that that would be a fruitful conversation for any of you after this semester. So, okay, so here's the lecture for today. On Tuesday, we left off with the promise that today I'd be speaking more in depth about the poets Yom Apollinaire and the Campos Brothers, Geraldo and Augusto, as competitive examples of what concretism looks like from both sides of World War II. There's a sense, as I mentioned last time, in which concrete poetry is best understood in its historical context as a radical break from the more conventional look of poetry, as everyone had known it through all the different literary epochs with changing aesthetic tastes that everyone underwent from period to period. But it's not enough to know that concrete poetry has a visual design that complements the thematics of the poem's content, because, as I'll explain shortly, that can get you into trouble if you don't have a sophisticated understanding of the different ways that form and function or form and content can interact. Now, Yom Apollinaire, the first of the two I'm going to be talking about today, was a French poet and artist, often known for his affiliation with the Surrealists of France and Italy. He was wounded in World War I, and then died in 1918 during the Spanish influenza epidemic that occurred just after the armistice and wound up killing around 20 million people worldwide. It was horrible, as you might imagine. His book collection, Calligram, appeared posthumously in 1918 and collects all of his concrete poems. And I don't know, I mean, well, I'll get to that in a second. One of them looks like the Eiffel Tower, for example. Another looks like a woman with a hat. And if you go ahead and Google Calligram Apollinaire, you can go through some of those Google images, and I just like to think about it in terms of somebody picking this up in 1918, flipping through all of these and wondering, where did this come from? I had no idea Apollinaire was doing anything like this. And where did this come from? Because it doesn't look like anything else I've ever seen. So it was mind-blowing then. It's still kind of mind-blowing, I think. One of the poems that I had you read for this week is called Le Visée, which is French for the aim or the goal, but the poem itself is fanned out like a visor or a woman's fan. The poem that requires more attention, perhaps, is called L'Être Océan, and looks like a giant sun, complete with rays coming out of it on the side. It looks kind of like the suns that my daughter will draw on her whiteboard, but better, because they're made out of words. You may not have been able to tell this without context, but the line that's just below the header on the right of the poem mentions Chapultepec, which is a reference to the Aztecs of classical Mexico. Jeune fille au Chapultepec means the young girls of Chapultepec. So clearly Google Translate will only get you so far. Sometimes you still need to know that Chapultepec was indeed an Aztec city. Now, if you know anything about them, the Aztecs worshipped and also sacrificed virgins to the sun. So the radiating lines are not really all that benign at all in terms of demanding that violence against, in this case, young women. So there's an ambiguous valence here. On the one hand, bloodthirsty God. On the other hand, the same sort of sun that we've all been celebrating for the past 2 days and having vanquished what was left of winter in Virginia. Now, Apollinaire's most famous concrete poem is one that I didn't assign to you precisely so that I could spring it on you right now. It's called Il pleut. Thanks to the magic of the internet, I can also show you the original French and then link you to a version of the poem as an animated GIF. And because, as a professor, I have near limitless power over my students, I will also subject you to my horrible French pronunciation. Ready? Il pleut. Il pleut des oies, des femmes, comme si elles étaient mortes même dans le souvenir. C'est vous aussi qu'il pleut, merveilleuses rencontres de ma vie ou gouttelette. Et ces nuages cabrés se prennent à unir to un univers de vie auriculaire, which actually doesn't translate all that well either. Écoute s'il pleut, tandis que la regret et la dédain pleurons une ancienne musique. I have to read this closer. Écoute tomber les liens qui t'y retiennent maintenant et en bas. Excuse me. Here's the translation for those of you who've been desperately hoping that I would get to the English as soon as possible. It's raining women's voices as if they have died even in memory, and it's raining you as well, marvelous encounters of my life, oh little drops. That's the gouttelette. Those rearing clouds begin to neigh a whole universe of auricular cities. Listen, if it rains while regret and disdain weep to an ancient music. Listen to the bonds fall off which hold you above and below. And then even if you're watching this as the video and not taking a look at the transcript, I urge you to look at the transcript now so that you can see the link to the animated GIF, which actually has the words raining down. And the concrete poem set to motion so that the words do rain down. And that is, in case you're seeing this on YouTube, www.eratio, and then as one word, postmodern-poetry.com/editor_il_plu.html. What this proves about concrete poetry is that Apollinaire was about a century ahead of his time, and that the act of reading words down the page, as if water droplets raining, presaged what HTML coding can do for us today, except this poet thought of this tactic long before computers were even a glimmer in Alan Turing's eye. But interpreting concrete poetry presents the reader/viewer with a problem that more conventionally visual poetry does not present, since it can be difficult to know the degree to which the poet intended the image to supplement the text of the poem, or for the image to be the poem in essence, a naive tactic, all things considered, in the same way that the Imagists believed that they could constrain the reader of an Imagist poem from thinking anything other than the prefabricated interpretation that the poet had built into the poem was naive. And it was. It was. Readers are going to think whatever they want. Some of us resist all the stronger when it seems like we only have one interpretive option handed to us. If it were true that concrete poets had basically collapsed the visual design of the poem onto the content of the poem, then we could accuse them of what Umberto Eco, who among other things is the author of The Name of the Rose, but also a professor of semiotics, has called the, quote, iconic fallacy. The belief that, and here's a quote from Eco, a sign has the same properties as its object and is simultaneously similar to, analogous to, and motivated by its object. This term comes from the classical Greek Orthodox iconography, religious hagiographic images of saints and the Holy Family, that the faithful would pray in front of, and some suspected of actually praying to the icon, to the image, worshiping the image, rather than worshiping the religious figure that it represented. Right? I don't know how likely a reader would be to read Il pleut by Apollinaire and confuse the poem for rain, but that's beside the point. If we suspected that Apollinaire believed he had created the iconographic equivalent of rain, or, more to the point, barred his readers from thinking of anything but rain merely because of the concrete image, we should all become iconoclasts and rebel against that practice. But again, there's a difference between suggestivity, like I'm going to suggest that you think about rain, and enforcement, I'm going to force you to think about rain. There's a difference. And the animated GIF version of this poem bears that out much better, I think, than a static image. The repetition of this sort of deja vu feeling is what the form of the poem conveys. this feeling is like the sound of women's voices in my memory, right? I mean, it's raining down upon me in a way that I can't stop. It's already a suggestive metaphor rather than merely talking about rain anyway. So, yeah, it's a suggestion rather than something that's forcing us to think first, foremost, and only about rain. It's a spooky and haunting poem in ways that can't be explained or dismissed by way of the iconic fallacy. This brings me to the Campos Brothers, who saw themselves as carrying out, as the scholar Marjorie Perloff has argued, one of my critical heroes, a rearguard action to formalize the gains made by modernist experimentation. The pre-war experimental poets had made it possible to manipulate words in space without readerly blowback. They had also planted the idea of the vortex of moving print rather than merely print that was stylistically arranged in space. Words or language that was so energetic that it was going to reenact its own movement in the mind of the reader, because you couldn't help but be moved. I think de Campos' poem SOS makes more sense if we imagine the middle abbreviation at the bottom of a sucking maelstrom, kind of like swirling downward like the drain in a tub or something like that, with all the surrounding circles rotating above it and surmounting it. I like to think of the middle word as aware of all the others, which all appear less vulnerable than the SOS because they're not plaintively crying out for help. In that sense, it upends our normal associations of priority and centrality being pretty much the same thing, because you end up in the middle, right? But that SOS is, in a sense, the most vulnerable part of the poem, even though it is central. But you wouldn't even need to associate SOS with the distress signal in Morse code in order to get there. Although, as with Il Pleut, I'm prepared to argue that those concrete poems that make something of the separations between words in a poem are savvier at using every single bit of data to their visual advantage. In other words, just as the words of Il Pleut resemble separate drops of rain falling interminably, right, because there's that little blank space in between them, the separate words of SOS resemble the staccato dots and dashes of Morse code, for all the help they bring to the helpless figure trapped in the middle. So to wrap up, when you read a concretist poem, do focus on the image that the words of the poem constitute. But don't be fooled into thinking that, once you recognize that image, your work as a reader/viewer it has been completed. As with any discussion of poetic form, the meaning lies in the interaction between the words themselves and the medium by which they are conveyed. So that is the way I'd like you to be thinking about this. But just in closing, I mean, some poems are obviously concrete in that there is this sort of designed image. And some poems that are on the list of poems to be read for this week, clearly, although they are manipulating where the words appear in space, right, and even maybe doing what I was just talking about in terms of getting you to be thinking more forcefully about some of those words because of where in the line they appear, as with that single hanging indent in a station of the metro, petals on a wet black bough, right, is more forceful because of that indentation. And that has something to do with the look of the words on the page. Very little to do with like how long I pause between those two lines, right? So even if the poem does not constitute one of these nice pictures, it doesn't mean that it's not influenced in much, if not all, of the same motivations that influenced Apollinaire and de Campos. Because literature was moving in the direction of more visuality and away from the assumption of aurality. All right? Okay, so that is the end for today. Next week we're going to be talking about the language poems and poets and the whole movement that constitutes that. I'd like you to continue thinking about the visual appearance of these poems on the page, even though, as you'll see, the language poetry is about something very, very different. I will be making the case that it's actually much more related than it may seem. All right, so until then, have fun on Twitter and think poetic thoughts.